All right, so in this video, we're going to continue telling the story of the Reformation, and now we're going to get it going with the protagonist of the story, or at least the first part of the story, Martin Luther. So we're going to get the Reformation going with some Reformation beginnings. And we are going to take a quick look at the life and key events of Martin Luther. So Martin Luther was born in an environment in which we're seeing a lot of big changes. So let's think about Luther's environment. So we're in the midst of the Renaissance, kind of the tail end of the Renaissance. Luther is born in 1483. Luther is born in 1483, in the height of the Renaissance. So we're seeing that religion is still important. But there is a growing secular life too. We're seeing an explosion of printing and vernacular languages. And this will be a smaller topic that we examine after we finish the Reformation. But we're also starting to see the emergence of monarchies that attempt to control all the activities within their borders. So kind of think of these as like early or proto-absolutists. So this is what's going on in 1483 when Luther is born. So let's talk a little bit about Luther's life, or at least his early life. So he was born in what is now Eastern Germany. To a family of minor nobles, kind of like middle class people. So he's born in Eastern Germany. The family of I'm not even sure they're noble, but they're definitely middle class people. So they're educated in the law. So they have a skill. So they're not just laborers, they do skilled work. So they're educated in the law. And Martin Luther went into the family business. So he eventually went to study the law and philosophy. But he found this work unfulfilling. He was unfulfilled by this work. He didn't he was good at it, but it didn't feel right to him. According to the stories about Luther, he had a near-death experience in 1505, which caused him to join a monastery. Apparently, the near-death experience involved being caught outside in a thunderstorm, which for most people would not be considered a near-death experience, but for Luther in 1505 it was, and so he went and joined the monastery. Now, as a monk, Luther was not great. Luther wasn't suited to this life. For one, being a monk is a life of solitude and simplicity. So basically, the life of a monk involves sleep, work, prayer, food, repeat. Maybe not in that order, but that's essentially what a monk does every single day. And Luther kind of fell into a deep despair or a deep depression, and he only could focus on his flaws and his sins, which caused him to punish himself physically. So he would actually whip himself because he felt like he couldn't get rid of his flaws and his sin. And so he actually started whipping himself as a punishment. Now, he was eventually persuaded. By his superior to think about religion as a process of change rather than a set form. And this changed Luther for the better, although he still wasn't that great of a monk. So not a set form. So this made him feel better, but he still wasn't suited to the life of a monk. So in 1512, now he's been in this monastery now for 7 years, his superior asked him if he would leave the monastery, not because he was being kicked out, but because there was a better job for him. If he would leave the monastery to become professor of theology at the new University of Wittenberg, which was near his hometown. And Luther agreed, and this turned out to be the right place for Luther. This was a place where Luther's intellectual curiosity could be used in conversations with colleagues and with students. It allowed him to still engage with religion, but do so in an academic setting, which was more his style. And so as the professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg, this is where Luther finds himself. And through his study, both as a monk and as professor of theology, he comes upon this realization that makes him feel like he's found what religion's purpose is. And so, what Luther finds is that he finds that the concept of salvation comes through faith alone. And he reinterprets a verse in the Bible. For those of you curious, it's Matthew 13:31. So if you want to look that up on your own, that's where Luther kind of finds the thing that he had been looking for as a monk that he couldn't really ever find. And he focuses in on this idea that salvation doesn't come through going to church or doing good things. It comes through faith alone. So faith in God alone brings you salvation. So fast forward again. So we're going to now jump forward to the period of time in which Luther writes his 95 Theses. So we're going to jump ahead in Luther's life to 1516. In 1516, Luther encounters, if we want to think of Luther as the hero of the story, we would think of this guy as his first antagonist, the first villain of his story. He encounters Friar Johann Tetzel. Now, Tetzel is the Pope's commissioner for indulgences. He's the Pope's commissioner for indulgences. Really, what he's doing is he's going around from town to town selling indulgences. So he is selling indulgences. So an indulgence is a it's a papal waiver of your time in purgatory. So purgatory is a Catholic idea in which you've done sins, you've committed sins in your life, but these sins aren't bad enough to send you to hell, but there's still a stain on your soul, so you can't quite get into heaven. So purgatory is like an unpleasant waiting room where you kind of burn off your sins waiting to get into heaven. So what an indulgence does is it gets rid of the time you have to spend in purgatory. Essentially, what an indulgence is a get into heaven card. Now, you can probably see what Luther's problem is with this, is that essentially what people are doing is they are buying their way to heaven. So Luther sees people all over Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire, buying their way to heaven, when Luther knows that heaven comes through faith alone. The only way you get into heaven is to have faith. And so Luther has a problem with what the Pope is doing. He's selling something that you get for free. So, and by the way, he's doing this. The Pope is selling indulgences to build a fancy new church in Rome. And you've probably seen it before. It's called St. Peter's Basilica. We'll just start that over. St. Peter's Basilica. So if you've ever seen the Pope do like a Christmas Eve Mass or an Easter Mass or give a sermon, more than likely it's in St. Peter's Basilica. So that's the church that Indulgences built. So Luther sees Tetzel doing this and has a problem with it. So really, only God can decide who goes to heaven. So God decides who has faith, and God gets to decide who goes to heaven, not the Pope, and certainly not Friar Tetzel. It's God that decides, not rich people. It's not their money. God decides if you have faith or not. And so Luther sat down and wrote all of his problems with what the church was doing. And on October 31st, 1517, Luther publishes the 95 Theses. So Luther publishes the 95 Theses. Basically, what these are a list of academic issues that Luther has with the sale of indulgences and church practice in general. So he's writing this list. He's basically publishing an academic paper saying the church should not be selling indulgences, and he's got a bunch of other issues with the way the church is handling itself right now. But it's really just an academic response. There's also the legend that he nailed it to the church door in Wittenberg. There's not a lot of evidence to say that he actually did that, but if he did do it, lots of people nailed things to the church door. It was like the community bulletin board. So if you were going to publish something you wanted the town to see, that's where you'd put it because you know everybody would go by the church door. So by the end of 1517, so only just a couple of months, by the end of 1517, the 95 Theses had been published throughout Germany, and when I say Germany, of course, I mean the Holy Roman Empire. And by the end of 1518, it had been translated and was spreading across the rest of Europe. So it was specifically seen in England and France as well. So this is the power of the printing press. So before Luther or the Pope even realized what was happening, the 95 Theses had been published, and millions of people were now aware of what Luther was saying, And they were also aware that the church was doing stuff that it shouldn't be doing. One reason that the church held this monopoly on education and knowledge was to keep people from knowing the bad stuff it was doing. But now, this guy is airing all the church's dirty laundry, and everybody's now aware that the church is kind of corrupt. So by this point, it's now been over a year since Luther has done this. At the end of 1518, Luther is finally contacted by the Pope and told to stop. And told to stop talking about this stuff. So stop talking about the indulgences and the 95 Theses and all of that stuff. And this just makes Luther more anti-Pope. Luther becomes more anti-Pope because the Pope doesn't have the authority to tell him not to do this. And he starts preaching that the Pope doesn't have authority and that Christians should only follow what's in the Bible. Because anything else isn't Christian. So anything else, anything that's not in the Bible isn't Christian. And guess what's not in the Bible? The Pope, the saints, the idea of excommunication, which basically cuts you off from God. None of these things exist. So Luther is going around telling people the Pope isn't Christian, the saints aren't Christian, excommunication isn't Christian. Those are things that were created by the Catholic Church, not by Jesus. It's not in the Bible. And the Pope takes the next step. The Pope puts down his trump card. The Pope excommunicates Luther. In 1520. Luther doesn't care because no one can tell a Christian that he or she can't talk to God. The Pope doesn't have that authority over people. No one can tell someone they can't talk to God. Everyone can talk to God. So Luther gets excommunicated. His work is now outlawed. It's now illegal to have a copy of the 95 Theses. The Pope has now used all of the weapons in his arsenal. So now, and we'll start with this in our next video, the Pope has to turn now to his earthly officials. So he needs to use people who have actual political power, not just religious power, to get Luther to shut up. So the Pope is going to turn to political leaders to try to get Luther silenced, and we'll pick the story of Martin Luther up tomorrow with the next round of issues for Martin Luther, which now involve him getting arrested by political authorities. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.